Alright, so I just got this model of the Villa Savoy by Corbusier that I'm going to treat as a concept model, and it really is. It doesn't have a lot of detail there, and I'm going to then assign some materials and lighting so I can create some presentation views of this. And at the moment I've got just a plain grey material assigned to everything. So I'm going to open up my material editor. There's the sphere on the main toolbar, and you can see all of these default slots. And so if you haven't used this before, this is the main way you access and manipulate materials in 3ds Max, and it's a much more logical system really than Revit. If you found that the way Revit manages and assigns materials is confusing, then you're thinking in the right way. If you think it's easy, then you don't understand it, honestly. The way Revit does it is extremely complicated because of the way they expect you to manage materials, and it uses a lot of things that you wouldn't maybe have come across as yet. So if you think that it's when you have to duplicate the appearance as well as duplicating the original material, things like that, that should maybe ring some alarm bells when you're working with a program like Revit, and you might have wondered why you have to do that. And the reason is that it is set up to manage more complicated things than you have to usually. Max, on the other hand, only works with the appearance side of things. So it's just like the appearance tab in Revit, which makes it much simpler. There's no graphics tab to worry about. There's no separate list of materials to worry about. So what you see here, this group of tiles, they're all different individual materials. And if you assign those to an object, then that's the material it's going to have. And there's no other name you need to duplicate or anything like that. So usually the process is to select a slot. These are just sample slots, so it's your working space. And so this is 6 by 4, so we've got 24 slots available there. If you right click, you can change that number to say 5 by 3, which will give you 15, or 3 by 2, which will give you 6. It doesn't change the number of materials you can have in your scene. It's just your working space, so that you can select materials and change them. The ones up above are pre-made materials, and you can see they have different settings. Choose them. A lot of them will look pretty similar at first, but some of them will look pretty obviously different. And so it's not a bad idea to keep those in case you want to use those as a starting point. So I'm going to go down to one below, which is just a plain grey material, and I'll give it the name of the first material I'm going to make, which is paint white. And just so you can see it more clearly, I'll double click on that slot, which will give me a larger preview window of it, and you can adjust the size of that as well. So you can close those anytime you like, and easily just bring them up again by double clicking. I'm also going to turn on the background, so if you click on the little background icon on the right, that'll give you a multicolour background, which gives you a good idea of the reflections that the material is going to have. And then I'll change some of the settings. So firstly, you need to notice or know what kind of material you're working with. So you'll see down here it's got Arc and Design on the button down to the right. So that's the sort of material it is. If you click on that button, it'll bring up the map browser. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but I'm going to show you some of the different kinds of materials you have. You've got the standard materials, which are really the old Max materials. You need to know they're there, because sometimes when you get other files, they'll still be using these, and in some cases you will want to go back to these older material types, like the most basic one, which is standard, down here. But then below the standard materials, you've got the mental array materials, which are really the more current materials, and these are the materials you use in Revit. They started life in 3ds Max, and then about, I think it was about 10 years ago, these materials first were introduced into 3ds Max, and then about 5 years ago they ported them across into Revit. And if you really want to learn how the rendering materials work in Revit, the best way is to learn them in Max, because in Revit a lot of the settings are hidden and you don't know often why things behave in the way they do until you understand how they're set up in Max, because that's really how they started life and where they've come from. So all of these materials, Autodesk Ceramic down to Autodesk Water, they're the materials you have available in Revit. The one at the top of the list, Arc and Design, is really what all of these materials are made from. And so that's what we're using here, Arc and Design. You have these others as well. Car Paint's a really nice one for using, obviously, for cars. And then these Subsurface Materials. Has anyone come across Subsurface Materials? You'd be looking at them all the time. Skin is a really common material that has subsurface properties. So in other words, it's partly translucent. The light goes through your skin, and you can actually see through it a little bit, and the light does refract and work within the skin. Candles are another one. So there are lots of materials that use that subsurface property, and so they have a special set of materials for those things. So lots of options for materials, but as I was saying, Arc and Design covers a lot of them, because these Autodesk materials really are just modified versions of the Arc and Design material with settings taken away. I'm going to cancel this, but I just want to give you an idea about material types and why you have different settings panels below that. It's because of the type that's set in the first place. So this Autodesk glass material above, you can see Autodesk Solid Glass has a different panel, basically because it's a streamlined version of Arc and Design. So if you're making materials from scratch, I'd recommend just using Arc and Design. And you'll see there's a list of templates that give you a really good starting point, so you don't have to know all the settings to begin with. I'll come back to those in a second. Just trying to familiarise you with that setup in the dialog box there. And below the templates area, you'll see the main properties. And over to the right, you've got the colour. And this is an easy one to miss because you've got several colour properties. But the first one there, that colour swatch, is your main colour property. That's your diffuse colour. So have you come across that term diffuse before for colour theory or anything like that? I don't know where you might have used it. Where have you been using diffuse? For lighting, maybe? So it basically means the main reflected light of the material. So in this case, it's this main grey area, and if I click on that grey colour swatch, then I can adjust the colour, and that will change the main colour. Alright, so you've got there a value from black to white, and if you missed that, all I did to bring that up was click on the colour itself, not the button next to it. So the value sets the brightness from black to white. Then you have hue and saturation, which I'll come back to. But then above that, you've got your primary colours. Now, if you haven't already done it, this is a good chance just to quickly look at primary colours used in computing, because they're sometimes a bit different to what you might have been taught or used in painting or in graphics. And so have you been using red, green and blue as primaries mostly? Yeah, good. Is anyone still using red, yellow, blue? No? There's nothing wrong with that. It's good to be aware that red, yellow, blue can still be used. It's more of a traditional model of primary colours. But in computing, the equivalent to red, yellow, blue would be cyan, magenta and yellow, because that's working with pigment. And so when you're working with red, green and blue, if you're not working with pigment, what are you working with? So pigment is subtracting colour. The light hits the surface, hits the pigment, and is absorbed by the pigments essentially, and then certain light is reflected. So that's, do you know what that colour model is called? If it's using pigment and you're absorbing colour? So that's subtractive colour. So that's one method of creating colour, and in the graphics program that might be a standard way. When you're printing, you print with cyan, magenta, yellow. So when you're working with red, green and blue, what are you doing if you're not subtracting colour? You're adding colour. Okay, so that's the way you need to be thinking. So as you add more colour, you get closer to white. Less colour is closer to black. So it's good to just bear that in mind, but these sliders make it pretty intuitive, because you can see as you click on each part of the slider, it'll show you then what's going to happen if you click on another part. So there, if I take blue away, it'll make this colour green. If I add red, it'll make it orange or yellow. Okay, if I take green away now, then it will make it sort of pinky red. Okay, so it's different to working with paint, but it's really important that you can create and manage all your colours using those primaries red, green and blue. And it might not be obvious at first, but you can do exactly the same things using hue, saturation and the value. That's just another way of doing the same things with your primaries. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about colour, but with programs like this you need to be able to create all the colours using the primaries, and there, to get a white or an off-white, they'll be basically even. So I've got my white colour. It's good not to go to 100%. And then the main other property I want to adjust here is the reflections. So below this diffuse area you have reflection. So I can take the reflectivity down, which will give me more of a matte surface. Taking it up will make it fully reflective. Then you have the glossiness, which is basically the spread of those reflections. So if I take that down, you can see that this highlight is going to spread out more and the reflections will be more blurred. So there I'm just clicking and dragging on the spinners next to the number, and now you can see I've got more of a matte reflection, or more of a glossy reflection, but it looks matte even though it's on full reflection. So I'll take that down and you can see again something similar. So you don't always just want to adjust the reflection, you want to look at the glossiness as well. And so then I've got the refraction, which you probably don't need to worry about with a material like this because it's not transparent. So reflection deals with the material being reflected by the surface. Refraction is light that travels through the surface. You've got some other panels here that affect those reflections. So the anisotropy and the BRDF, which is bidirectional reflectivity fall off. And again, you can play with those if you want to get more different options for reflections, but for now I'll just leave those. So those are the main settings for your basic plain materials that don't have a pattern. So now I want to assign it to my object. I'm just going to select something, and you can see that this actually there has the it's coming as one object, so I'll just show you how to separate those. So if you missed it, all I did there, once I'd selected the object, was to right click and then isolate selection. So I can see there that I've got the columns now as part of the walls, and I don't want that, so I want to separate these columns just by selecting the object and go to the Modify tab. You can go to, well, first I'm going to right click and then convert to Editable Poly, because it was an editable mesh before. and then I'm going to click on Element and see if I can select those columns there with the crossing setting on the main toolbar there. Let's cross over those. And then I'm going to choose Detach and call in Columns. Then the ground there, again, once I've selected it, I'll choose Detach. And then just going back to the Editable poly, I'll now again right click, isolate selection, and you can see now just those objects. So don't worry if you need to break things up into separate objects, it's always easy to do with Editable polys. And now with the material editor, I can just again, with the material, either click and drag onto the object, or use this button here, Assign Material to Selection. So now I want to see the other objects again, so I'm going to right click, End Isolate, and you can see that that's a different colour. Oops. So then I'll select my my ground, yeah, and maybe I'll make a material that has a pattern. So I'm going to go to just right click, isolate selection, and I can see just that that ground surface. I've selected a new material slot there. You can see again it's Arc and Design. So now using those templates I mentioned, I'm going to choose Polished Concrete. I'll double click so you can see that material. And so it's that easy to make a material like that, which in Revit would be a bit more work. So I'll turn the background on as well so you can see the reflections, and we can see it's fairly reflective, maybe a bit too reflective. So I'm going to reduce the reflectivity and also the glossiness there. It's a bit too much. Okay, so I also don't know the size of that image. So you see now next to the colour, it's got this M icon coming up on the button there. So if I click there, it'll take me to the map, and you can see there this one actually has two maps within it, and so you'll need to check these when you choose or to make your own materials. And so there you can see the first one has a file name. So I'm going to click on that, and then you can see when you see the bitmap properties, you can see up there it says bitmap. There we've got the bitmap properties, and I'm just going to click View Image so you can see the image file that it's using to create this concrete. So this is an option you have in Revit, of course, as well. But in Max, you get the ability to control the location of that that image, which you don't have in Revit really. So I just wanted to show you the image so you know what I'm adjusting. I'm going to turn on this option here, Use Real World Map Scale, or Use Real World Scale. And you can see then that it's much smaller in the preview window there, because it's now 1 inch. 25.4 millimeters is an inch. That's the default size. Just looking at this image visually, you can see that a piece of concrete like that would, well, how big do you think that would be in real life? I mean, it could be any size. You could have it maybe as small as 200 mil, or as big as a metre, maybe. Depends on the scene. So yeah, I'll probably make it about a metre, and because it's a big building. So I'll make that width 1,000, and the height a bit less than that. You don't need to be all that accurate, so it could be half or maybe a bit more than half the width. So maybe 700. Okay, so now I can see the image again, and we can see then that it's tiling, and again this is something that's hard to work out in Revit. It's tiling a bit too much maybe, so I'll make it even bigger. So 1500 by 1000. Again, it's still tiling, but maybe enough, or I can live with that amount. So I'm going to go here, back up to the parent. So this is often where people get stuck, because you've got the bitmap properties here. If you click on that go to parent button, which is the sphere with the arrow, until you're back to the top, then you'll get the original materials properties back. I'll close this one, and now I want to assign it to my plane. So again, you can either drag it across or use this button here, assign material selection. Now, if I zoom in there, I should be able to see this. But zooming, it's not really showing it properly. So you've got here this shaded option. First thing to check there is to change that to realistic. I still can't see it. So I'm going to go and just show you a trick here. If you go back to the bitmap properties, and then click on this button here with the checkerboard pattern and the light bulb, that will show you the image by itself. Now, I know it's still not going to show it to me because there's one last setting I need to check, but I just want to show you that option. That's a really important thing to get images showing properly in the viewport. And so the main issue there is the size. So the final concept with materials is mapping. So this is done for you automatically in Revit, which makes life a bit easier, but then when you need to control it, it makes it much harder. So in Max, you have a modifier you can assign to any object called UVW map. That gives mapping coordinates to any objects. Here, planar would be okay if this object was flat. It is at the moment, but I'm going to give it some depth, so I'm going to change it to box. And you can see there the most important option, which is real-world map size. So I can definitely see the image there, and zooming in, that map size would work pretty well. But because you're working on a concept style presentation, you might want the image to just give the appearance of concrete, or just give an indication that it's concrete without being a perfect representation of it. So it'd be fine to just play around with that size until in the viewport it looks the way you want it to. So you can make it 5 meters by, say, 3 meters. There, the tiling's still pretty apparent, but if I end isolate, it's not so bad. I can live with that. So you've got to remember that Max, even though it can do things very accurately, it's still really a graphics program at heart. So it's fine to just get the graphics the way you want them to be, rather than trying to model things the way they are in real life. So then with this plane, I'm just going to, again, isolate it. It probably should have some a little bit of depth rather than being flush with the ground. So I'm going to go back to the original poly and just extrude it. So we're going to go into there. Actually, maybe I'll just make it. Yeah, I'll make it 100 mil. And it's gone a bit too far, so I'll just type that in again. 100. There we go. Okay, so that should bring it above the ground, and I'll just show you another material with a texture, so that I can get maybe some grass, and just show you another way so that it ties in with maybe what you've been doing with Revit. So I've selected this bigger plane, and if I go into again the material editor there, and I'll use the next slot across, and this time I won't start with an Arc and Design material. I'm going to replace it by going to Get Material. So if you've been wondering whether it still has a material library, you'll see then it's got Autodesk Material Library, and that again is the same as what you have in Revit. So there you've got the site work folder, and you've got all the same graphs and other things that you do in Revit. So you can just double click to bring it into your editor. And again, just click on this button here to assign it. This button with the checkerboard with the light bulb will show the map in the viewport. And notice I've done this at the top level because it should usually work that way. And zooming in, we can see then that grass material is basically the right size, because this object has that option there to use real world map size already turned on. Okay, so it's just something you've got to watch out for with materials. You need to know how the size is being set, and usually that option there is what you want, use real world map size. And so maybe just to finish off, I'll show you a glass material. So just isolate these. So again, I need to just select part of this, or in fact I'll just make a new box. No, it's fine. Okay, so I'm just putting this roughly in place. So glass in Max should have a depth rather than just doing a single surface for it. So that would do for a glass panel. I'm not sure if it's actually glass there in real life, but just so you can see how to do glass. Really easy. With the material editor again, just making sure I've got Arc and Design. You have templates there for different kinds of glass, and for this project you shouldn't need to use anything more than thin geometry. So glass thin geometry there is for things like windows, and then if you assign it in the viewport you should be able to see through it. So really easy, and again that's the same as the glass that you have in Revit, but you get a lot of options that you don't have in Revit as well. So later on, if we have time, I'll show you a lot of other options you have for materials in Max, but that should easily get you started. And then before you have lighting, you can try the different stylized displays. So if you want to get a different style of graphics that you can export to a graphics program, notice that with these it does use the materials that you've assigned. Okay, so there on that stylized menu you've got the different graphics presets. I've got similar things in Illustrator, I know, and so you can play around with them as well. So you can also just try taking a hidden line view into Illustrator, but you then often need to clean up some of those things. So shaded with edges is another good one. Sorry, it's not doing my edges, so let's do it from there. Again, this model was made with the old modelling tools, so I'd have to clean that up. Even in realistic, yeah, that's going to be a bit odd. So I think they're probably one of the stylized ones would be the easiest. And they're fairly easy to you know, adjust and fine tune using Illustrator or even InDesign. You can do things Photoshop if you really want to, but Photoshop's probably the worst for things like this, unless you're doing materials again there. But let's see how you go. Alright, so I better to save those. Under the Tools menu, you can go to Preview, Grab Viewport, and then create still image file. You don't need to give a name, you can just click Grab, and then click the Save button and save the format you want. So you don't have to render, and that's something you maybe would be just doing automatically, because in Max it is a common approach, but you definitely don't have to. So that could then be opened in a graphics program.